Hello and welcome to How to See Spiritually with me, Mark Vernon, a series of talks about intuition and the eye of the soul. If you like the talk, please do share it, make comments, and also visit my website. In this episode, I'd like to talk about imagination. For some spiritual writers, imagination really is the key human faculty that enables spiritual sight, that enables perception at depth. It's seen as a truth-bearing faculty, not just mere fancy. It's that which enables us, with the eye of the soul, to enter into this sort of intermediate transitional zone and so develop our spiritual sight. A very big writer in the Sufi world on imagination like this is the figure of Ibn Arabi, who wrote a lot about imagination as a capacity to enter a kind of intermediate space between ourselves and the world of God, the world of spirit, and whether we feel we're walking away towards or within God, he said, imagination is what enables us to do that. But in order to get a fuller sense of that, I think we've got to confront head-on the sort of modern problem with the imagination, which is the idea that it's mere fancy, that it's just the byproduct, the random upflows of our brains that means really nothing or only very, very little and probably can't be trusted, should just be allowed to pass away. In the romantic world, the world of Wordsworth and Coda Ridge, in the Anglo-American tradition, this is known as fancy, to distinguish it from imagination proper. So it's worth sort of making that distinction. One of the ways which I think it can be done is using some insights from psychotherapy, because psychotherapy has developed its understanding of imagination in order to distinguish it from mere fancy. Broadly speaking, what happened was that when Sigmund Freud first started to develop psychoanalytic ideas, he thought that everything that human beings imagine in their minds was some kind of fancy, that it was probably the product of early experience, and that it was a way of defending against early experience, trying to negotiate early experience, trying to make something good out of otherwise bad early experiences. So he actually thought that all the arts and all of music was a sublimation, in his word, a sublimation of early experience, trying to sort of make something of it. But it had no truth, no status beyond itself, therefore. The imagination was just your imagination, just my imagination, didn't connect with anything beyond our own experience. Now, a later psychotherapist called Winnicott, very important in British psychotherapy, he said that this can't be the case, that it can't be that all imagination is just mine and all your imagination is just yours, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to share things which we imagine, and they'd be so personal, so idiosyncratic that they would make sense to no one else. And yet there's clearly quite an extensive language of the imagination. You know it when a great imaginative poet like William Wordsworth writes of his experience above Tintern Abbey. This communicates something to you as well as having communicated something to him. So Winnicott argued that our imagination, whilst it can certainly make mistakes, can certainly miss reality and just lead us into delusion, on occasion it must connect with something beyond just ourselves. It must connect with reality. And then it can be understood by someone else. And also it gives us a sense of being grounded in life. Again, if it was all mere fancy, we would be a bit mad all the time, actually, floating around, never quite sure what was real, what was false, what was true, stumbling in delusion, maybe even feeling a bit sort of psychotic. And yet that's clearly not the case, at least not all the time. A wonderful poem, a great piece of imaginative literature, an experience which opens your imagination, seeing a wonderful view, climbing a mountain, these kind of things, they actually make us feel more real, more grounded, more connected with things, not less. And so Winnicott argued this is the way that imagination can become a truth-bearing quality, and so it can become part of seeing things more spiritually, perceiving life at more depth. Now, having trusted that at least some part of our imagining can yield truth, can connect us with depth. The question is how we discern that, because discernment is clearly going to be very, very important. And Coda Ridge, one of the big romantic figures, he had a very neat way of doing this, he suggested. He thought that fancy, mere fancy, can't create anything new. What it does is it just repeats. It goes around and round in circles. It takes what's already known, sort of sticks it onto other bits of what's already known, and a bit like a surrealist painting, just makes a sort of jumble, or makes a mockery, or makes some fun, perhaps, of what we take to be the case already. But it doesn't really develop in anything. It just goes round in circles. It just repeats. That is what marks it out as fancy for him. Not necessarily bad, but not this spiritual capacity. Imagination, though, is different, because imagination takes us into a new world. It actually can be developed. It can become part of our everyday experience. It's that which we would think of as inspiration, as well, that which somehow opened a door. It's very important in science. Albert Einstein, for one, realised that imagination is a key tool in science because it opens up a possibility of considering the world in a different way, that then can be developed through maths, through experiment, through testing, and so on. But imagination, as it were, is the first step that opens onto what's new and otherwise hadn't been perceived. I think that this is what makes a great work of art from a work of art that's more like an experiment. When a work of art becomes a great work of art, it's because it speaks to many, many people, and we feel that if this work was lost, something immense would be lost, not just in terms of the history of art, but perhaps to all humanity. This is a work of art that's imaginative and truth-bearing. It matters to all of our souls, to all of our perception of life, and so we give it immense value. So that's how to distinguish sort of between fancy and imagination. Does it seem just sort of random borrowings and cuttings and pastings, or does it actually, in time, with discernment, lead into a completely new sense of things, a completely new path? And that was certainly how the spiritual adepts have always treated imagination, that imagination that can open your mind onto the inner life of the cosmos, of nature, of the divine, and make you more aware of things, make you feel more grounded in life, enable you to know more than you would have otherwise done, particularly at this soulful, felt perception of things. This is what marks it out as spiritual imagination and really makes it so very, very valuable. I think a key figure, a key practitioner of this that I've greatly valued is William Blake, the British poet and mystic William Blake. He was a great champion of the imagination. He actually interpreted the whole of Christianity through imagination. He's called Christ the imagination. And what he meant there was that through the promise that we too can know God, can in a way become incarnations of the divine. One of the ways that shows itself is that we can share in the creativity of the divine, that human beings are creative creatures, if nothing else. And that is to share in a kind of divine activity, a work of the imagination. For Blake, all of creation is, as it were, God's imagination, as it were, moving through the divine imagination when we move through life. But we're also able to make little eddies of our own imagining in that flow, you might say, that we too can contribute to that. And that is one of the great joys William Blake thought about developing spiritual perception, that actually becomes creative. It isn't just that the world expands before us, but that almost we expand the world too, because we're asked to be co-workers, co-creators with the great divine imagining. He summed it up once when he said, there's nothing now proven that was not once imagined. There's nothing now proven that was not once imagined. And imagination, therefore, is that which expands reality, which grows reality in our sense of it. Not because it was sort of always there and we've discovered it, although that's part of it, but also because we too are part of a reality growing, We sort of know that, when someone new is born, the person who was not there now is there. And when that person then dies, something tremendous is being lost. They're not fungible, to use the philosopher's word. You can't just put another person in their place. Something unique and particular was lost. And individuals like William Blake have had a very keen sense that the imagination sort of opens the space, the potential space into which something actual can then be made, can be created. And this is part of the divine emanation, part of creativity itself. The imagination as a truth-bearing faculty which we humans have, not fancy, not just repeating, not just going round and round in circles, but with training, with the disciplines of the imaginative arts, scientific know-how, can become part of a growing sense of life, and also seeing things in more spiritual depth.